I was willing to let you go with it. Molly was calling you on it.
Rightfully so, rightfully so.
Do you want to get a recording or anything going, or are we
Yeah, we're
all
all set.
we're all set?
Yeah.
We're going? Okay. I don't have a gavel, folks. So bang, bang, bang. I'll call this meeting to order of the Santa Cruz City County Libraries Joint Powers Authority Board. Do we have a roll call, please?
Yeah, board member Colburn,
Here.
and board member Heffiker,
Here.
board member Goldstein,
Here.
and board member Legault. Here.
That takes us to public comment. This is the opportunity for anyone to address this board on any items that is not on today's agenda or on the consent calendar, but we don't have a consent calendar, so do we have any public comment? Seeing none, I'll close public comment and take us to general business. We have one item on today's general business, which is an update on cost benefit analysis for library administrative services. Do we have a staff presentation, please?
We do, thank you. So Marisol Gomez is going to help present this to the board this morning, and I will pipe in at certain points, and then we'll take it to conversation.
Thank you. So Marisol Gomez, Assistant Finance Director for the City of Santa Cruz. Thank you for having me here today, and it was a pleasure working in conjunction with the library team on this project. So we have a short PowerPoint for you guys today. We're just going to go over background, executive summary, and project team recommendations. So as some of you may know, the 1996 Joint Powers Authority was formed in 1996 with the counties and cities of Scotts Valley, Capitola, and Santa Cruz. The Fourth Amendment was approved in December 2015. The LFA establishes the MOE contributions for those participating cities. And then also our current MOE agreement is set to expire in less than 7 months, June 31st of 2025. So the Administrative Services Agreement, which was established in 1996 between the Library JPA and the City of Santa Cruz for Administrative Support Services Agreement, was last amended and approved November 2016. Some additional background: in Section 6 of the original Library Joint Powers Authority Agreement, there was a 5.5% of net operating costs of the library system as a methodology for costing the administrative services originally. We have moved away from that because there wasn't a nexus to the services being provided to the library JPA. In 2015, the Fourth Amendment of the Library JPA superseded reflecting administrative services by the most efficient and effective and efficient model available, thus removing the 5.5% methodology. In 2016, the Administrative Services Agreement, retroactive to December 2015 at the time, put forth the city's cost allocation plan as the methodology for costing out the Administrative Services Agreement. In 2023, the city updated the cost allocation plan to the current salary, operating, and workload metrics, which created a large increase to all departments. So prior to that, the cost allocation plan was being updated sporadically through CPI adjustments, so it didn't compensate for all of the salary increases that were happening and the COLAs, which were different percentages than the CPI adjustments. The Library JPA and the city agreed to embark on the cost benefit analysis project due to the increase that was presented in that last cost allocation plan, and agreed to temporarily increase the library JPA's portion by 4.5% until completion of the project. Going to hand over the next couple slides to Christopher.
So don't try to strain your eyes on that. This is in the packet in 3 different versions, but this table basically is the executive summary of the proposals that were put forth. So you may remember when you first contracted with Matrix to look at this work, you asked 3 basic questions or 3 scenarios. One where the library would continue contracting with the City of Santa Cruz for these services. A second one in which the library would hire its own staff through the city to perform these services. And then a third scenario, which was the possibly partnering with other regional JPAs or to contract out those services through another agency or organization, all based on the cost analysis and level needs assessed by the matrix group themselves. This morphed into this table that you see before, and some of this may be familiar to some of you. The top line, I'm just going to very quickly highlight 4 of these, the ones that we think are the most plausible. Scenario 0 at the top, that's the existing cost allocation plan from the city, and that's the cost that came out, the 1.2 million that kind of precipitated this whole study in the first place. Matrix came in and applied a methodology which kind of pulled some items out of the cost allocation plan for things that weren't really relevant to the library. So these, like city council, police, much of IT was decreased, some budget was decreased, et cetera. And they came up with a revised cost allocation plan of $931,000 per year. And the details on that are start on page 13 of the packet. We can get back to that later if you'd like. Scenario 2 is a position-based and overhead analysis, and that answers the question of if the library were to bring finance and HR in-house, this is what the costs would look like. And those details start on page 21 of the packet. Scenario 3 and scenario 4 are the other ones that we really want to draw your eyes to. And there's a scenario that applies the existing cost allocation plan, and then there's a scenario with the B after it that applies the revised cap of 931,000. So scenario 3B, this is where if we were to, based on some of Matrix's assessment and recommendation, hire an additional HR person dedicated specifically to the library, an HR analyst 2, this is what the cost would be, an additional 343,000. And that formula is on page 29 of the packet. And then a variation on that is if we provided for that resource, but didn't have it dedicated to the library. In other words, we would share that additional analyst too with other agencies within the city. That's this revised scenario 4B. And that cost is 12.4% of the cap. In other words, the library share of the CAP. That's how that cost gets allocated. Scenario 5, you don't see any data there. It was decided a few months ago that this was not feasible at this time to look at other organizations who might be able to provide these services based on conversations with them and the data that we were coming up. In terms of some general overall perspective here, I did want to point out the LJPA in terms of the city represents 5.5 of the city's indirect support, but we are 12% of their workforce. So that's a ratio to keep in mind. And I think for now, that's it on the executive summary. We can come back to that in conversation. And then the recommendation, because this is a special meeting, with really just one agenda item, the recommendation is really to receive and file this report for moving forward. We did list some next step considerations for choosing a scenario. The first one, of course, is methodology. Whatever approach we decide on, the cost reflected in these scenarios should get updated annually prior to the budget season, and we've already confirmed that that is something that is possible between the two departments. It should be sustainable. So it should last over time, be comprehensible and scalable. So we don't find ourselves in this situation again. It should be transparent. So it may not encompass every scenario. It is important to review important changes that may need to be incorporated going forward. And we did actually recommend in the staff report, if there's a change that represents more than 10% increase or decrease in the overall cost, that there would be a special flag for that. And then the services, the revised agreement should clearly state the contracted support services. So everyone going forward knows exactly what the support services agreement encompasses. And I think we have one more? Nope, that's it. And so that's, this finalizes Matrix's work for this organization. So we've just got the final invoice today. So this completes their work. As well as the individual staff work that went into this. And I just want to say, having come into this halfway through, I'm really impressed with the amount of staff input and knowledge that was brought to the table. So I want to give my thanks to the team for doing that. And now I think we're ready to answer questions.
Great, thank you so much. Questions from the board?
I have questions and comments, but if I could, I'll just start off with also acknowledging the collective efforts put in both by city and library staff. I know that there's a lot of collective interest to have to juggle here. And I think we all on the board have also been struggling with coming up with a defensive methodology that feels equitable and is a bit more aligned with best practice when it comes to cost allocation. And I think we would all acknowledge that having some form of an artificial annual escalator is really not the best way of really adequately capturing the value of these administrative services that are being offered on an annual basis. So I think the matrix study does a good job of capturing, attempting to capture in a more metric-driven, performance-driven way. But I will acknowledge that these are big numbers, and I'm sure we're all reacting to that. I will also just say though, and I guess these are comments and not questions, but I really appreciate having the range of options. So we have some things to work through as a board as we land on what's the best way to manage this going forward. And I appreciate those additional alternatives that were kind of built into the model there. And I think it warrants a lot of discussion. I'm sure both here this afternoon and offline as well as we land on something that makes sense. So those are my initial thoughts.
Molly, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I guess, and I didn't make it all the way through the full report in detail, so I got through most of it, but, so scenarios 3 and 4 increase the level of HR services that the library receives, and is that, can you tell me some background on why that was considered or needed to be considered?
Sure, that came out in the initial assessments, best practices assessments, and that's also the second part of the packet that went out in the group, so you can see some check marks. In that assessment, and also just in conversation with Sarah DeLeon, who's here, it was decided that we could benefit from additional resources in HR just because the library is a very demanding department. We're 12% of the workforce. We involve HR quite heavily, both in the metrics that are set forth here, like in the number of PAFs that go forward and what have you, and then just in all the day-to-day work of answering questions has been described to me in a very positive way. The library is a very engaged workforce and has no problems picking up the phone to ask questions. And so we involve HR pretty heavily. And so that was a demonstrated need early on.
So when the matrix assessed and they looked at all the functions of HR and how to allocate those across departments, that wasn't captured in that initial assessment, or just the city itself doesn't have enough resources to meet the needs of the library? I'm trying to understand.
I think I can speak to that a little bit. So in the best practices assessment, you'll see the multiple departments and how they met, succeeded, or partially met the services that the library needed. Accounting, finance, for instance, we had some areas where we partially met, but mostly met. And given the staffing that we had now, we felt like we were adequate staffing related to that level of services that were being provided. For instance, when we were asked to do additional review of the budgeting, we had the staff to be able to make the time to do so. Some of the HR needs, and those are some of the needs that in discussions with our chief of people was in order to fully support and bring most of the check boxes up to partially meets or meets would require an additional person.
Okay, and that wasn't identified as a citywide, every department need, it was specific to the library.
That's correct, this best practices assessment. However, we did want to provide those two scenarios. One where it's a direct allocation to the library only used by the library, and another one where it was indirect allocation through the cost allocation plan, where the other departments would be utilizing that staff person.
A little bit, it seemed like it wasn't much of a difference in cost. Right.
Did we capture it right, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just gonna say to emphasize, it's still a citywide need, so either scenario, whether it's dedicated or not, the need is there.
And the $343,000 is for one FTE?
Yes, and that formula, I Cause I have it written down.
It's on here somewhere.
27.
I looked on page 29 and I didn't see any breakdown in that.
It's on page
27,
27.
I think.
27.
Yeah, so you'll see table 19, it's the top line if you're hiring an HR analyst 2.
Okay, I think those are my questions.
I don't know if this is the question for, Sarah Marisol, but in that scenario 2, we talk about kind of ratios, the 1 to 50 versus 1 to 100, that's in the study. And then we sort of show the ratio kind of including temps and not including temps. And the ultimate recommendation was for 3 FTE in each department. And obviously, if you went with the lowest number of 1 to 50 and you only use current staff, I think it would suggest like 1.4 FTE. Sorry, 2.4, 1.2 from each. Obviously, that wasn't sort of the recommendation. To maybe each one of you could talk a little bit about kind of the thinking that went into, or, you know, the 3 FTE versus a smaller number for scenario 2.
I can start us off, just to recap, the scenario 2 is an alternate method of looking at the services holistically, but being able to zero in on, the certain staffing and the costs associated with those staff. So instead of saying, we do a little bit here, and here, we said, okay, let's just look at finance and HR and be able to provide that number to you. And then maybe Sarah, you can talk a little bit about the HR piece.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the 3 rounded from the 2.4, to be honest, besides the heavy calculation of the administrative overhead. Scenario 2 was provided to us by Matrix.
Yeah,
So I'd be happy to go back with Marcel to see if the 2.4 is more appropriate for that, but.
the 2.4 number I was mentioning was just based on the 1 to 100 ratios for both HR and finance, and only counting current staff. And so then they're at a high, they said, well, another ratio you could use is 1 to 50, and if you include FTE, then it would be 3.2 per department. So we ended up in a number in between. And I think, you know, not to answer my own question, but I think some of that just went into looking at the actual workload associated with HR and what work needs to be done within the library, as well as on the finance side, and look at those things.
It seemed accurate to me. I did not love this scenario just because of the heavy push of all the administrative work into that calculation, like. The FTE is really looking at our HR analysts 2 at the top, and then all the rest of us, your principal analysts, my role, negotiations is in that administrative overhead, which is a little hard to piece out. So I don't know if I'm just adding to the topic, but not
Yeah.
my favorite scenario.
Yeah, no, I don't think it was any of our favorite scenario, and we didn't really dig into it, mostly because the number that spit out was so big, and
Right.
we kind of just sort of said, well, that doesn't look feasible.
Mhm.
Like, I was thinking more about it, and thinking, well, if it was 4 FTE total, but you know, that's maybe a conversation we could have moving forward if we really thought that was something we wanted to consider. Okay, are there other?
I have a
Questions,
question
yeah.
between, just as we're considering this, as we move into budget development. Should we give the library more HR resources, scenario 3B and 4B? I'm wondering just the level of, obviously, a dedicated person is probably more ideal, but what does the library get from the additional HR resource allocated, like in terms of the level of service and maybe in comparison to the full-time position, if it's easier to compare it that way?
Sure.
That's a good
I don't know if you need me to stand or sitting here is fine. If it were dedicated, the thought process would be that their time would be allocated to employee and labor relations, as well as various aspects of classification studies. So employee and labor relations would include training specific to the library, whether that's higher level career development or more internal development for their HR liaisons, and more dedicated how-tos, the legal aspects of recruiting, those types of things dedicated to them. But also maybe career development, looking at job specs, for example, Christopher, of how we bridge people from one step to another. So really honed in and focused on the library's needs, same aspect with the classification studies, working faster towards those job descriptions, updates or creations of new classifications. Obviously, if it's dedicated, you feel that, 0 to 60 in 2.7. Instead of if it's allocated out across, it would be a similar level of service, but you're just gonna feel it in a longer amount of time because the rest of the city also needs those aspects. We have a lot of need to do and want to do's that we would like to do better. I think the training to our supervisors and managers is one of the most critical that we're already spending time and energy on. But who doesn't love a nice dedicated dial-in 911 number to the department, so. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, that helps a little bit, yeah.
Do you think that there could be a rationale if we were to explore that 3B scenario where there was the dedicated HR support, that there would be a kind of a different cost allocation plan model for HR then? Like, I think we talked a little bit about this in one of our meetings was, would there be some sort of decrease in the amount of kind of overall cost allocation plan coming out of HR if you're paying for a dedicated person in HR, you know what I mean?
I don't know if I can speak to that terribly. The money part's not my authorities.
Yeah.
I don't see why not. I know that's kind of starting that up, 6 months hiring, keeping someone on board. So I'd probably leave that to finance on any potential deductions, but.
We did talk a little bit about, the HR scenario is an augment, so we're not reducing the current
Right.
work that's being done right now with the current staff. This is in addition to. So it's not necessarily, there might be other savings, there if for some reason, the allocation, that they're able to pick up is different than what's spread. But, just remember this is those two scenarios we're augmenting, adding to instead of reducing the existing.
Right, I think it comes down to what our expectation would be around level of service, right? If we're talking about an augmentation and a value add in addition to the level of service that is currently being provided to the library, that's one question. If it's an offset and we're interested in having a dedicated person while at the same time acknowledging that perhaps on the cost allocation side, we're talking about a reduction of overall level of service. There's probably some value engineering to do there, but it's
Yeah.
more of a policy question, I guess.
No, I saw it as a bit of a policy question. I thought, there's an interesting relationship between augmentation and, because obviously at some point HR is gonna get to a lot of those things that Sarah just went through. Question is, just like you said, 0 to 60 in sort of 2.6 seconds versus, taking us more like a VW bus speed or something, taking longer to get there.
I guess the other question I have, just from an operational efficiency and effectiveness standpoint, I think there's also perhaps an argument to be made of having the benefit of the entire HR team
Oh, absolutely.
in terms of supporting the library system versus having a dedicated person that's gonna come with their own skill sets, whatever those may be,
Right.
versus having just a more robust bandwidth across all the disciplines within the division as a whole, the department as a whole. So I think it's an operational question. I get the benefits of perhaps having the bat phone to call a dedicated staff person, but we often do that within the department anyways, in terms of having a lead assigned to our various operating departments so they know who they can go to. So that's just, another thing for us to consider.
Yeah, that seems operationally challenging when you've got the cost allocation plan that covers a portion of a lot of people, plus a person who's supposed to be dedicated, and then workloads and management of that. Seems like it could get a little complicated.
Right, I mean, they get a phone call, I need help with expediting the recruitment. Okay, well, I'm not assigned to recruitment, but I'll work on lobbying within the division to try to get something moving. It's just,
It's different.
I think I'd be more of a fan of looking at an increase in the cost allocation and overall bandwidth of the team.
Okay. Is there any public comment on this item? No? All right, I'll bring it back to the board for further deliberation, potential action, or just to receive and file, kind of anyone's call. We want to move forward.
I make a motion to accept and file and want to thank the board members that have been involved in this work all the way through and the collective staff teams that have been involved with it, and look forward to more conversations to come.
Second?
All right, we have a motion, a second. Before we take a vote, let me just ask for a little bit of, kind of timing. Like, when do we need to work this all out by? Because obviously at this point, we would just be taking this information in. You know, from an ideal standpoint, I don't know, Christopher, if this is you or a Marisol question, when would you love to have this all worked out?
By the end of the week. I think that, as you guys noticed, the MOE negotiations will be starting shortly if they haven't started already. And I would hope that enough of this has been decided on by the time those negotiations are being wrapped up. And I don't know that, are you starting those in January
Well, we've
or?
already kind of met,
Okay.
but, yeah, we need to start talking about it again in January. We were, I think, wanting to see some of this kind
Sure.
of happen, and then, we had done various other research, so, yeah, between January and March, I believe they have to be wrapped up to get to an agreement.
So we can do budget planning and all
Correct.
that sort of
Yeah.
stuff, which we've already started.
Yeah,
I would also just suggest, and I think you guys are already aware because you've acknowledged it, it would be nice to be able to tell staff that this is wrapping up and the direction it's going
Mhm.
Sure.
for their
Yeah.
own comfort levels.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, if there's no further discussion, we have a motion to receive and file the report. Have a second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Against? Motion carries unanimously. So with that, that takes us to our schedule of upcoming meetings. Looks like our next meeting is February 6th at 9 AM at the Aptos Branch Library. I got that right?
You do.
Whew, all right. And adjournment. Thank you all for
guys.
coming.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
folks.
much.
Yeah.